Welcome to Building the Future, hosted by Kevin Horick. With millions of listeners a month, Building the Future has quickly become one of the fastest rising programs, with a focus on interviewing startups, entrepreneurs, investors, CEOs, and more. The radio and TV show airs in 15 markets across the globe, including Silicon Valley. For full showtimes, past episodes, or to sponsor the show, please visit buildingthefutureshow.com.
Welcome back to the show. Today we have Tobias Kunze. He's the CEO and co-founder at Glasnostic. Tobias, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Kevin.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on the show. I think, well, you've done a ton of really interesting stuff. And with Glasnostic, I'm actually really fascinated to learn more about that selfishly. But before we get into that, let's get to know you a little bit better and start off with where you grew up.
Oh, yeah, sure. So I grew up in Germany, more specifically in the south in Bavaria, in
Cool.
Munich. Um, Born and raised there, went on to study in Berlin. I
Cool.
actually did not study technology. I did study music, more
Okay, interesting.
specifically classical music, composition and conducting.
That's fascinating.
And yeah, to me, it's a straight line into tech. As you know,
100%, yeah.
music. There's it's a lot of mathematical aspects to it to some degree, and went on to do cloud. Not cloud. Went on to do sound synthesis,
Okay.
and that was a straight shot from there into the computer world.
Okay. I find it's interesting that I find like a lot of people in tech like were a musician, still are a musician, or heavily into music, or all of those things.
Yeah, it's the abstract mindset, right? It teaches you to form a mental landscape of what you're playing, what are you composing, what are you listening to, even, right? And it's the same thing you do in programming,
Sure.
right? You need to visualize, create a mental model of, the program you're creating, the code, and, the functionality that you're creating.
Sure. Well, and I think too, just creating something out of nothing, right, is
Yep,
so similar, right? It's fascinating. Um,
absolutely.
Very cool. So walk us through your career, getting your PhD, and then I want to dive into Glasnostic.
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, on the sound synthesis side, digital sound synthesis side, when I did it, there was a lot of programming involved. We did this still at the university, but this is on old VAX computers.
Okay.
So there was a little bit of programming to be learned, in particular, then coding in C and stuff like that. Then I started collaborating on an algorithmic composition software that actually came out of Stanford, and
Interesting.
then ended up, spending a year at Stanford, simply being a visiting scholar there. And then the decision was, am I going to do a PhD back in Berlin, or am I going to do this in Stanford? Ended up applying at Stanford, and got accepted, right?
Very cool.
And so ended up doing this here. I actually did not finish it because, the sucking sound of Silicon Valley was pretty loud. Did a bunch of internships, worked at Silicon Graphics, in the, when it was a crazy cool company, worked on the O2 workstation,
That's cool.
and, and again, digital media, audio stuff. Very exciting work. Remember, there's a one demo to Skywalker Sound where we were able to, in real time transpose things in certain channels, keep other channels um, constant, and that was a great effect, obviously. So that was exciting work, and then got sucked when the dot-com boom happened. Got sucked into internet startups, and really have been in startup land ever since.
Interesting. Okay. So walk us through coming up with the idea for Glasnostic and what exactly is it?
Yeah, really good question. um, so Glasnostic is my second company, right? The first company, I was the co-founder, the technical co-founder of a platform as a service.
Okay.
Technology, think of this as a Heroku, but behind the firewall.
Interesting.
That was acquired by Red Hat, became OpenShift ultimately.
Cool.
And yeah, so spent a couple of years on that side looking at how do you optimally support the building of applications. Support the developer. Essentially, you write your code, we're going to run it with all the enterprise abilities built in, with all platform abilities built in. And but then notice that, who's writing these simple applications anymore? And back then, those used to be like 2-tier, maybe 3-tier applications. There's clearly before microservices, but it already became apparent that these little 2-tier deployments really were a part of a much larger application landscape. So there was a much larger architecture around it, and the abstractions of the platform as a service that we built didn't really address that. And it became clear that the interplay between these application pieces ultimately are the important thing to manage. And that's exactly what we do at Glasnostic. Because what people do in cloud production today still is something goes wrong, something happens in production. What do you need to do? What do you do? You go back, you analyze it, and you go back and you change code, or maybe you change configuration. You change something statically, because that's what we grew up and what we learned to do. Right?
Sure, yeah,
we know
totally.
how to go, right? So something doesn't quite behave right. So you go back, you fix your code, you redeploy it, and you hope that it's gone, and you fixed it. So you release patches, and that's not only, that doesn't take a lot of time. And so on one hand, but it's also very unclear whether it's actually going to fix it. So what we do at Glasnostic is take almost an air traffic control approach to that problem, and we go in and fix things as they happen in production, and simply by changing how the network works, simply changing how applications and services and functions interact with each other in real time.
Okay. Interesting. No, totally fascinating to me, because but like, how do you do that? Because like, I very much understand the problem that you guys are solving, but how do you do that? Because we all know that you patch one thing, it breaks 30 other things, or that's the running joke, right?
Exactly. It's everybody's experience. You deploy multiple times a day, and 1 out of 2 or 1 out of 3 times something else breaks, seemingly unrelated. You don't know, is it correlation? Is it causation? You have no idea. And you know what? Most of the time, it's not even worth finding out, because the situation is different half an hour from now, because something else gets deployed, something else scales out or scales in, right? It changes all the time. It's not just requirements that are changing, runtime behaviors change. So we take the view that most of these runtime behaviors are not practically, it's not practical to fix them in code. You just simply need to have a way to control them. And if you zoom out, that's exactly what air traffic control does, right? It's easy to, it's an airspace problem, right? It's very easy to run 10 planes in an airspace. You can see each other, you can radio each other, it's not an issue. If you have hundreds, you need somebody that sees everything. There can't be anything you don't see. And then at a very high level, make sure nobody affects each other unduly. That's what we do. The air traffic controller calls the pilot. We change things on the wire.
Got it. Okay. Okay. So first off, I guess, are you language agnostic then? because you're so high level, or how does that work? Or how do you actually
Yes.
connect into the code base?
We do not connect in the code base. And it's
Okay.
extremely important that we don't do that, because in
Okay.
most situations, unless you're a small startup or, you actually don't own everything. It's not your
100%.
code,
Right.
right?
Yeah,
You
totally.
depend on things. You don't own things. You don't even have the chance to change the code. So
Yeah,
we sit in the wire between applications and services and functions, whatever, and SaaS services.
sure.
And we'd simply change how many requests we allow, how many requests we allow in parallel. We shape the latency. We shape and calibrate bandwidth. Very high level. Like, again, the air traffic controller. We don't care. Is it a helicopter? Is it a plane? Is it whatever it is, a UFO, right?
Sure.
We simply tell the pilot, um, this is your position, go to this altitude, take this direction, and fly at this speed. Right? That's the level of management that's required to run production successfully today.
Sure. Well, especially big big companies, right? Because
Absolutely.
there's
Yeah.
so much happening. And
Yeah.
if you're well, and then I'm assuming even from a security perspective, you guys can handle if somebody's getting like trying to get hacked, or you can like redirect traffic. Like, can you do that kind of stuff?
100%.
Yeah,
Yes.
okay.
Security is one of the big aspects of what we're doing. It's flow control. So it's a lot of, it's data flow control. We can act as a zero trust control plane. Don't even allow systems to talk. So
Oh,
the
wow,
entire
interesting.
attack vector um, before the connection is accepted, we can interrupt that connection, right?
Okay. So then how does a company actually integrate your technology into their platform then?
So we are what network people like to call a bump in the wire.
Okay.
I always prefer calling this a brain in the wire because we're a little bit more smart than just a bump.
Right.
Um, so we insert ourselves in the data plane in modern speak. And how we do that is environment dependent. We are not a single technology company in that regard. We are not an
Okay.
eBPF company, right? We are not an Kubernetes only company. We are essentially an SRE platform. And that works
Okay.
in all major environments. And we simply inject ourselves into the network, into the data plane, into the data path, and then we can take control. We can calibrate, we can regulate, we can shape, we can deny. Right?
Right. So is it just a software play, a hardware software play, just a hardware play?
It's just a software play.
Okay, that's what I guessed, but
Yeah.
yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. So you're working with the company then to help, like, is it customized per company then? Or do you kind of have like here's generally what we do, and then people have like add-ons, for lack of a better term for it? Or how does that kind of work?
The technology is agnostic. It's not specific to the company.
Yeah,
Every larger company has these issues, and they're essentially complexity issues.
yeah,
And how we're being used, though, differs slightly from company to company. And there's a lot of cultural aspects to it. How
right.
is the team
Interesting.
organizations? How many business units are there? All these things play a huge role. What are the sensitivities, the primary use cases? Is it more security focused? Is it more performance focused? Is it more cost management focused? Is it more reliability focused, right? These things determine how people use our product, but the product itself is very horizontal.
Okay, interesting. So this might be a stupid question, but could
Mm.
you use it for user testing then too? Or like to see what features are popular, or what pages are popular, or what's not being used to, or like that kind of stuff, or not really?
We can show this at a very high level. Keep in mind, we are really much more like a radar screen in air traffic
Okay.
control,
Okay.
right? You don't see the full plane and how many people there are on the plane and what's happening there. You just see a dot on the screen.
Okay, that
right?
makes
So
sense.
like we don't look into the workload because again, most of the time you don't own it, right?
Right. Okay.
But we can show you how it's utilized. We can show you that a certain service gets overloaded, it
Right. Okay.
gets runs too hot. We can show you hotspots, these kind of things.
Got it. Okay. So yeah.
Mm.
So I guess, yeah. Okay. Maybe user testing is a dumb way of putting it, but yeah, that's what I was getting at. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Actually, that's really fascinating.
But load testing, of course, right? And
Right.
how do these components work together? What's the capacity relationship? Is there an impedance mismatch between those things? Those are the really thorny problems in operations. It's
Yeah.
not, do I call the API correctly? That's something that you get during integration testing. But what is the load testing? How does it behave when it hits a certain limit, right? And
Right.
everything today in these architectures run in some form of degradation all the time.
Right.
Most of the time, you don't even notice. Nothing bad, comes of it.
Yeah.
But every now and then, something bad happens. There's an egress that shouldn't be there. Why is the system talking to this other system, right?
Totally.
Maybe misconfiguration, malicious, benign, you don't know, but it's important that you detect these things rapidly. Or something gets overloaded and then it slows down, and it's always non-linear change of events, right? A little bit of slowness over there, maybe even a CPU issue, right, turns into a latency issue on the next system, and then turns into a retry storm, and so forth, right? It's a cascading change of events that, if you don't take control of them, ultimately will cause a great deal of damage and be very disruptive. So we
Sure.
take this out of the equation just by adding a modicum of control.
Got it. Oh, and then I could be monitoring, like if I have 30 different pieces of software, you can monitor all 30, right? From
Yes,
kind of my
exactly.
dashboard.
Yeah,
Is that fair to
yeah,
say? Okay.
yeah.
So, like, well, I have the interface up in front of me right now, but I'm
Mm.
curious, how would you describe it? Because there's it's very cool what you're showing
Mm.
people with your interface. So how would you describe it without a visual?
I keep coming back to the radar screen. Everybody
Mhm.
gets access to our product mostly, and almost 100% through the visualization piece,
Right.
which is essentially an auto-generated service map.
Okay.
Um, if you can't see what is running, you don't know what's going on.
Right.
And in particular, since we focus on the behavior, the aggregate behavior of services, not the threat of execution, right? We're not looking at the tracing of things. We're looking
Right.
at how do systems behave, how do components behave. And that is the first step to understanding. And understanding is always the first step to doing something about it. Right? Whether it's your own runbook, it's your own operational skills, your SRE skills, whatever it is, then our customers discover that some of these skills are much better applied through our product, or even
Right.
automatically applied, right? There's a learning curve behind it. It's a novel way of doing SRE.
Right.
It's essentially how we feel SRE should be done. But it takes a week or two. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's not that long, especially with how complicated the stuff that what you're doing is really complex. So if you only have to learn it in a week or two, that doesn't seem like a long period of time at all.
It's and ultimately you grow with the product
Sure.
over time, right? You start what do we see? Coming back to the thought from earlier, um, do companies use it differently? Yes, absolutely. They try to achieve their goals, and some people, for instance, teams realize at some point, oh, we can actually do, by exerting back pressure, we can do a whole lot of things now that were much more complex before. And then they do back pressure essentially for a few weeks and then discover, oh, we can also quarantine new deployments, which is
Ah,
just a different variation of the same idea by adding control to the to system behaviors. Right. So there's a
totally. Yeah.
learning evolution
Interesting.
behind it, right? Yeah.
Sure. So is the product web-based then?
So there's two parts to the product. One, I mean, call it the data plane. where that's the piece that gets kind of deployed in people's VPCs, if you will, on
Right.
premises, the new on-prem,
Yeah.
or even on premises, as well. And the control plane is something that is delivered as a SaaS, right? So that's simply
Right.
consumed, and most of the time through Glasnostic.com.
Got it. Okay. So then how does obviously the working remote factor into all this? Did you have to modify some stuff? Did it really matter, or walk us through that? Because obviously you potentially have people like in the office and then
Mm,
not in the office, wherever, right?
yeah. So it technically it didn't affect us
Okay.
because our data path piece always runs in your VPC, in your cloud environment, in your on-premise environment, in your edge locations, um, whether people work from home or not.
Right. Okay. That's kind of what I
But
figured. Okay.
yeah,
But there's a but. Okay.
but people working from home really accelerated complexity in companies' environments.
Right.
So that is a big driver for our uptake,
Sure.
because we thrive on complexity ultimately.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Fascinating.
Mm.
So I'm curious then, like, so how, well, I guess how long roughly does it take to actually implement into my company? Because it sounds like I could probably get started pretty quick and then kind of gear up as I learn more and choose more and more to do, or how long roughly does it take to get going?
That's exactly how it works. So everything we do with every customer is always, we start in a small environment. In the
Okay.
first environment, we install there, let's say the first VPC, right? The first Kubernetes cluster. And then it's the experience is always, wow, now the light switch has been turned on, right?
Right.
And then the next teams looks at that and says, oh, we want to have this too. So now we run in two
Right.
clusters or two VPCs or 20, right? So it's an expanding motion. And the initial deployment, it depends a little bit on how standardized the environment is. Kubernetes
Sure.
cluster, literally, it's a 30-second install.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Um, in VMware, it may take a couple minutes. If you have something on premises and there's weird firewall rules, that may take half a day, right? But
Right.
the install, our install itself, it's always doable, I think, within 5 or 15 minutes. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So really quick and people can get
Yeah.
started. Interesting. Okay.
Mm.
So I'm curious to dive a little bit deeper. Like,
Mm.
how do you manage your roadmap compared to feature requests? Because you probably get a, that all the time, or is it not really
Mhm.
because you're so high level?
Um, Most of our feature requests are integration based and
Okay.
automation oriented.
Oh yeah,
So
the automation stuff. Interesting. But
more
keep going. Sorry.
automation, easier automation, applying some of these remediating or preventive patterns, control primitives more automatically is a huge topic always, and that's almost 100% what we're working on these days. Because ultimately, um, when you run a complex environment, cloud production, you don't want to sit in front of nobody wants to sit in front of a console all the time, right? So you want to
Right.
get notified quickly. You want to be able to set up preventive um, control primitives, so certain issues can't even arise in the first place. You want to set up auto microsegmentation, which we already do. These kind of things make it just um, much more valuable in smaller team contexts, right? Not the large
Right.
enterprises which have ops groups anyways, but the more the SRE automation mindset, around it. That's really what we're focusing on these days.
Sure. That makes sense. Nobody wants like the 1,000 notifications. They want the like one notification that they really need to deal with something, right? Yeah.
Exactly, and that's really where we can shine, because if you imagine, right, as developers, we used to put printfs in our code, right?
Yep, totally.
Now we still do the same thing. It's just better stuff these days. It's like now we have an intelligent monitor in there. We have observability in there. But ultimately, the alerting is always coming from a deep, from a very finely grained metric. And if something happens that's large scale and a little bit nonlinear, as we talked about earlier, right?
Yeah.
You get hundreds of events because all these metrics start to trigger all of a sudden.
Yeah.
And now your teams jump on these alerts and then they do what they know how to do. They don't do what they should be doing necessarily. They know what they think it is. Right? So now you have a whole lot of like headless chicken mode in your organization going on.
Right.
Whereas what we do is look at what really matters, right? And what really matters is like, how does a system behave? What's the outward behavior? And very simple thought experiment, even like if you notice that between two systems, two components, two services, your requests keep creeping up, and all of a sudden latency shoots up out of proportion. That's a telltale sign that you're degrading now on the upstream, that your service component is actually running below peak performance because it's hitting all kinds of internal limits. And we detect this very easily. We can even validate this at runtime by just pushing back against the request for a little bit. See, does latency recover? Little inline experiment within 10 seconds, right? And then we have confidence that, yes, that's the case. Now we can throw an alert that, hey, your scaling doesn't work here. There's an issue. Your peak performance is your past peak performance every single time for a few minutes before you scale out. And these kind of degradations are triggers for outages.
Right. Well, and that would be very hard to test just from a developer perspective
You
without.
can't. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
Fair
you
enough. You can't is a better way
You
to
can't
put it.
because it depends on the exact situation in production right now. And it's going to be different 5 minutes from now.
Right. Yeah. Fair. Okay. Fascinating. No, that's really interesting and cool, actually, that you guys do that.
We're the only ones doing that in the industry, as far as I can tell.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I guess. Well, and I think the whole thing what you guys are doing is like pretty complex, but you simplify it for enterprise. Is that fair to say?
Yes, we just add a critical function that's really missing from data centers or from virtual data centers, from VPCs, right? And that is, I like to compare this with, a kindergarten.
Right. Okay.
What happens? We deploy our software just like if you would put 20 kids, 50 kids in a room and tell them to now, occupy themselves. And you know exactly what happens. Within 10 seconds, your noise level is at like 200 decibel and blood and tears are going to flow, right?
Yeah.
Because the kindergarten teacher is missing. There's this
Right.
management function missing where the teacher says, "Here, Jill, you go on this table, you play with Dave over there, and no, you use this toy, and in 5 minutes, this other kid gets it," and so forth. It's a capacity management task in essence. Right? It's a management capability that's missing, and we bring this back to the deployment.
No, very cool. But I want to get your thoughts and advice on, obviously you've been involved with a lot of really kind of stuff that a lot of people use every day and whatnot. And I'm curious to get your advice and what do you, because you mentioned before we were chatting about like growth mindset and kind of why it matters. And I think I would say maybe COVID kind of shifted that a little bit, or what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, so I think a common pattern that I see people fall into, and mostly obviously I deal with software engineers, right? I deal with
Sure. Yep.
SREs, DevOps people, and it's like taking the world as granted, meaning I don't have any influence on the world. I need to adapt to the world. And that's true to some extent, right? Of course,
Yeah.
there are forces that are larger than you are. But what people tend to forget is that um, not only do we change all the time because our experiences shape us, we can shape to a much larger deal than we think is possible. We can shape our surroundings. We can do something about it, right? And
Yep.
I feel too many engineers, too many, SREs um, feel not confident enough to learn quickly, to change the status quo, and to pursue a goal actively, if that makes
Sure.
sense.
Yeah,
Right?
I would agree with that.
Um,
I would
yeah.
used to put myself in that category perfectly, so I totally get with that. I
Yeah.
think that's
I mean,
changed.
there's somebody on the team, let's say, has a computer science degree from Berkeley or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Then that's regarded, or coming from Google.
Sure.
And so you don't dare to speak up because, that's the better credential. The credential doesn't really matter. What matters is what you do.
Sure.
Even a
100%.
smart person is not smart because they are smart, right? It's about what do they do with that smartness and the learned behavior. How do they apply it and when do they apply it, right? And to what
Yep.
effect? So that's, I think, the perspective that's often undervalued, I think.
No, I think that's actually really good advice and insightful. But I'm curious, what advice do you give to people to get over that though? Because it's really hard to change that mindset and decide that, like, yes, I want to make this change. And it's also really scary.
Yeah. Um, I'm not a psychologist.
Sure, sure,
I
sure.
think it gets scarier if you attach your ego to it.
Yeah,
If
good.
whatever
Interesting.
you want to do, you think it's you and your perception of self-worth um, hinges on the outcome of that action. I think it's way more important to simply do, uh, get shit done in
Yep.
French, and then reflect back on it. And yes, of course, you're not going to reach everything. You're not going to be perfect every single time. You're not going to reach the goal you wanted to reach, but you miss it only by a little bit. And then you can look back on it and you've already learned. And by putting yourself out there, by doing something, you've actually already changed your reality. You've
Right.
changed the world, your immediate surroundings, at least. Right? So I think that experience is important. Um, I think something that Mark Andreessen said many years ago in some interview, doesn't matter, right? Is that strong beliefs, briefly held. That has a little bit of that ring, right? Where
Totally.
yes, I'm going to do this. I'm going to put myself out there. I'm going to execute on that, and it may be wrong 5 minutes later, and it's fine, right? I can be a different person 5 minutes later.
Yeah,
Right?
interesting. I also think too, just people are still so scared to like fail at something. But sure, well, your idea fails and you have to do something else or you pivot or whatever. It doesn't matter.
Mm.
Like I just never understood why that mattered. Like, who cares, right? Like, but so many people get so, and maybe it's the ego thing. Like I I look back at my career, like how I don't even remember all the times I failed. It's been so many times. And like I'm not saying like catastrophic they're all the time, but like sometimes it's just like, oh, okay, that didn't work out next, right? Or it's okay,
Yeah,
I gotta like regroup and I gotta maybe like go find a job for a while or whatever, right?
yeah, yeah. I think it's self-worth. It's your self-worth is attached to the outcome of the task,
Right.
and as opposed to attaching it to to this the smartness and the dedication and all the other niceties of you executing that task.
Sure.
Hmm.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I 100% agree. It's fascinating. I'm curious then, what advice do you give to entrepreneurs or even developers? Because I've been in this space a long time, you as
Hmm.
well. I feel almost bad for people that are just getting started because it's so complex now compared to, even 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah, there's so much software. There's so many frameworks. There's so many technologies, right?
Totally.
It's a Cambrian explosion, really. Um, I don't have good advice. I think, kind of linked to what I just said, is like you start somewhere.
Sure.
In starting somewhere, I think the best learning is always by working on a project. Yeah, by
Yeah.
just doing things. Try to reach a certain goal. Try to implement something in a new language. That's how you learn a language. I've never learned anything different in a different way. Right?
No, I actually think that's really good advice. And I think there's obviously there's a ton of paid resources out there, but
Mm.
there's so much good free stuff out there, whether it's YouTube or other sites, right? And I think so many people forget about that. They're just like, well, I don't have the money for that. It's like YouTube is free.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Like there's not really an excuse, I think, these days in a lot of cases. If you really want to learn something, sure, I get that not everything you can find on whatever, but if you're trying to learn something new in a new language, you could probably find something that you're interested in that language, that you can find a tutorial on it, whether it's video or not, right?
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. It's like the resources are all there. I mean, from YouTube, you can do online classes, and from MIT, Stanford has online classes, right?
Totally.
All that stuff is there. There's way more you can watch in your lifetime.
Sure.
But so the other aspect there is that you iterate really, really quickly if you want to learn, new domain. Learn something in the first hour, then revise. How do you see the whole field? Connect it to your existing knowledge, right? Map it out as quickly as you can so you can judge whether a certain resource, a YouTube video that takes you 15 minutes to watch, is actually the right thing to do, right? Is it worth it, going deep on this side now? Or should I instead just watch 4 or 5 high level things that help me map out the whole space? Right? These kind of techniques are really, really important. I think it's lean startup for your own knowledge, right?
That's an interesting way of putting it. And yeah, I agree with you. It's yeah, like I don't know. I guess it's fascinating to me, and I would assume. Well, I'm curious. Do every year then, or every few months, whatever, it doesn't really matter. Do you try to pick something new to learn, or how do you kind of stay current with what's happening, and how, like, basically what's next or what's coming?
I wish I wish I had the time to pick
Sure.
new stuff. No, I'm running a startup, and it's every day.
Okay.
You spend 80% of your time doing things you're not an expert in.
100%. Yeah.
You haven't done before, at least in this, you know, particular shade of gray or whatever.
Yep.
So as a startup founder, you're con- continuously dealing with being outside of your comfort zone.
Sure.
So that's your learning essentially. Actually, I'm not even sure I would call it learning per se, because you don't get back to a certain thing for another 2 months, right?
Sure.
So you need to
Survival.
relearn it again. It's
Yeah.
a yeah. You got to do what you got to do all the time.
Yeah, that's fair. But then or like how, I guess, how, when you don't know something and you need to figure something out, what tools or resources do you use to actually figure those out? Like, are you go to like other people? You try to find it online? Like, where do you get that kind of like, okay, I don't know this. Where do you go first?
Yes, and I think that's a superpower that most people don't, in particular developers, don't don't build early enough, and that's your network. If
Yeah,
I have something I can't figure out or feel I should figure out in more detail faster, I can call up people.
right,
I pick up the phone, um, have a 2, 3, 4 minute conversation with somebody who's done it before,
right.
right? It's eh, That's absolutely necessary. Yes, you can read articles. Yes, you can do Google research. Um, but you'll find very quickly that it's actually not a good use of your time, because it
Right.
takes you a lot of time to find the right resources. Yes, you can search, but then an hour later, you still haven't found a good answer, right? Versus somebody who knows you, somebody you know, so vice versa, um, already has a lot of context where you're coming from, what your situation is, the company situation at the time, how they did this with other customers before, and so forth, right?
Sure.
Super valuable. So the value of network is immense.
Any advice
And
for
by the way,
building
in
that network?
engineering, the
Oh,
same
go
thing.
ahead.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay,
Yeah,
keep going.
in
No,
engineering, the
keep
same
going.
thing, right? You today, going back to the Cambrian explosion, you need to, as a developer, you need to do so many things. You
Yep.
are not an expert in whatever. Let's say you do something gRPC. You haven't done this before, or like very briefly. If you know somebody, you can call up who knows how to do that. You can ask them very specific questions,
Sure.
and that's what good engineers do. They don't know how to write a file system, but if they need something about file systems, they know who to call.
Yeah. No, I actually think that's really good advice. And it's surprising how many people don't leverage that network, especially if they have it. But do you have advice for actually building that network? Because it's challenging, especially when you're first getting started.
Yeah. And it's so funny because as kids, we have no issues doing that, right?
Totally. Yeah.
We
We like
we
lose.
make friends all the
Yeah.
time. We can talk about all kinds of things. That's how kids learn, by
Yep.
talking about random stuff at school, not
Yep.
necessarily in the lessons, but during the breaks, right?
Yep.
Um, yeah, it's it's the water cooler things. It's having common interests with other people, and then talk about technical matters. It's I think it needs to be casual,
Yeah. That's
right?
good advice.
Yeah.
Interesting. Very cool. But we're kind of coming to the end of the show. So how about we close with mentioning where people can get more information about Glasnostic, any other links you want to mention? And yeah.
Yeah, like always glasnostic.com. So it's glasnostic.com. It's like Glasnost and Perestroika, if you're old enough to remember, right?
That's awesome.
Glasnost really meaning transparency. That was what Gorbachev pushed in Russia. Glasnostic.com, and everything's there. My DMs are open on Twitter if you want to reach out, or otherwise I'm just Tobias at glasnostic.com as well on email.
Perfect, Tobias. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time of your day to be on the show, and I look forward to keeping in touch with you and have a good rest of your day.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kevin. It was a pleasure
Thank
being on the show.
you. Okay, bye.
Thanks for listening. Please visit our website at buildingthefutureshow.com to join the free community, sign up for our newsletter, or to sponsor the show. The music is done by Electric Mantra. You can check him out at electricmantra.com and keep building the future.